The void had always been cold, but never silent. Humanity had broken the light barrier, carved out fragile colonies on the edges of star systems, and declared themselves part of the galactic community. But in the grand scheme of things, they were small, an ambitious species playing in the shadows of empires that had ruled the stars for millennia. The Terran Defense Council clung to politics, funding half-measures and outdated defenses, never willing to admit how vulnerable they truly were. The Drakal knew. They had been watching for decades, their war simulations running millions of scenarios. Humanity would fall in 72 hours. Annihilation, total surrender, or a fractured resistance crushed in waves. Those were the only possible outcomes. The humans were too divided, too impulsive, too sentimental. A species that relied on intuition over precision, individuality over order. The Drakal had never lost a war. They would not start with this one. Their fleet emerged from the blackness like a tidal wave. No warnings, no ultimatums. The attack came with the precision of a predator striking prey that never saw it coming. Orbital defenses flickered, their outdated tracking systems failing to lock on to the Drakal's maneuvering. Automated turrets fell silent, power grids overloaded by precision strikes. Satellites blinked out of existence, entire networks vanishing in seconds. The first bombardment struck without ceremony. London, Beijing, Washington, flashes of fire and metal raining from above. Civilian comms flooded with panicked transmissions, overlapping screams of confusion and horror. The Terran Defense Council, fractured and bloated with bureaucracy, took precious minutes to respond. A desperate meeting was called, even as the skies above burned. Surrender. That was the word passed around the table. This wasn't a war. They hadn't even fired a shot. It was execution. But war had always been more than guns and ships. War was about minds. There was one mind they needed now. Elias Voss had been content in his exile, watching from afar as Earth's leadership suffocated itself in red tape. Once the architect of humanity's most daring military campaigns, he had been cast aside after one too many disagreements with the Council's spineless leadership. He had warned them. He had been ignored. Now they came crawling. The encrypted message reached him on an isolated moon in the Titan belt. A desperate plea, stripped of ego. Return. We need you. Voss stared at the words for a long moment. Then he powered up his ship. The return to Earth was a gauntlet of wreckage and flickering distress beacons. The planet he once defended was dying under Drakal boots. Yet something gnawed at the edge of his mind. A mistake. The aliens were moving too fast, too sure. They were overcommitted. Their war doctrine was predictable. Perfect precision, overwhelming force. No room for failure. No room for error. Humans thrived on error. On arrival, he was met with chaos. The Council, half of whom still wanted to surrender, wasted time debating. He walked past them. Past the frantic officers scrambling for a miracle, past the exhausted faces of those who still fought. He took command with a single order. To shut it all down. It was insanity. The Council called it suicide. Voss ignored them. Earth's digital networks, fragmented but still functional, were filled with Draka-I AI scraped data. They needed those feeds to coordinate, to predict, to control the battlefield. Voss severed them. The planet went dark, and then humanity started fighting like humans. Drakal formations found themselves walking into ambushes. Their landing zones turned into hellscapes of collapsed buildings, hidden explosives, and sniper fire from civilians. Ships descended into combat zones, expecting resistance to crumble, only to find entire districts empty. Only for warheads to ignite below them once they landed. The Drakal warlords faltered. This wasn't in the simulations. This wasn't supposed to happen. Then came the transmissions. Voss made sure they heard them. You thought we would fight like you. That was your first mistake. You thought we would break. That was your second. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The war had no front lines. Not anymore. Voss stood at the center of a dimly lit command room, the glow of holo-displays reflecting in his tired eyes. His officers, engineers, hackers, and tacticians were gathered around, their faces set in grim determination. The planet burned beneath them, but they weren't here to fight conventionally. That was suicide. No, they were here to do what humanity did best, adapt. He exhaled, staring at the projection of the Drakal fleet, its massive formations slowly encircling Earth like a tightening noose. We give them a war they don't understand, he said, voice firm. Welcome to Operation Mirage. A murmur rippled through the room. The details had been distributed, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real. Cyber warfare experts, you're first. The hackers nodded, already setting up their assault. The Drakal relied on AI for coordination, predictions, and logistics. Human unpredictability had already thrown them off balance. Now it was time to feed their paranoia. Within hours, false distress signals flooded Drakal comms, forged battle logs distorted their casualty reports, and simulated fleet movements led them into empty kill zones. Their warlords hesitated. Numbers didn't add up. Their perfect algorithms were failing them. For the first time, they doubted their own data. Far below, Earth had turned into a battlefield unlike anything the Drakal had prepared for. They were warriors of grand planetary conquests, marching in precise formations with overwhelming force. But in the shattered cities, they weren't fighting armies. They were fighting ghosts. The Drakal unit moved cautiously through the ruins of Berlin. The air was thick with smoke and static. Their scanners picked up phantom readings, nothing concrete, just flickers of movement. Every abandoned building was a potential death trap, every empty street a killing field. Then the first explosion hit. A column of fire erupted from the rubble, taking half their squad with it. The survivors had no time to regroup before shadows moved through the dust, rifles barking, knives flashing. The Drakal expected a fair fight. They got ambushes, sniper nests, remote explosives, and hacking pulses that fried their comms mid-combat. They had never trained for this. Humanity wasn't fighting for honor. They were fighting to make the Drakal regret coming here. Voss had spent years studying Drakal psychology. They were warriors, yes, but they had never tasted desperation, never fought an enemy that fought dirty. So he gave them what they wanted, a desperate retreat. Human fleet movements became erratic, falling back into the asteroid belt. The Drakal, sensing a chance for decisive victory, surged forward. They saw panic, weakness, the final blow. They didn't see the trap. Among the asteroids, mining drones lay dormant, repurposed into self-guided bombs. Derelict stations, seemingly abandoned, were packed with nuclear payloads. Voss watched from the command deck as the Drakal fleet pushed into the kill zone. His hand hovered over the controls. The moment their ships crossed the threshold, he pressed the button. The void lit up. There was no sound in space. But if there was, the Drakal fleet would have heard their own death coming. Hidden warheads detonated, ripping through unshielded hulls. Railgun slugs accelerated to insane velocities, punched through flagship after flagship. The Drakal fleet collapsed in minutes. Billions across Earth watched the live feed. The empire that had never known defeat had just lost its first major battle. To the very species they had dismissed as unworthy. For the first time, the Drakal hesitated. The victory was real, but it wouldn't last. The Drakal fleet reorganized. Their warlords, now humiliated, sent the second wave. Voss leaned over the holomap, watching the reinforcements appear on the edge of the system. He exhaled. They're learning. The real war had only just begun. The Drakal had never known failure. For centuries, their war machine had expanded, assimilating or annihilating every species that stood before them. Their war doctrine was a masterstroke of efficiency. Precise, overwhelming, methodical. They did not fight battles. They ended them. But here, in the ruins of Earth, something was wrong. Warlord Kirath loomed over a flickering holomap, his armored claws flexing in frustration. His fleet had done everything by the calculations, yet human resistance refused to break. Worse, it was evolving. Explain. His voice was a growl, barely containing his rage. His sub-commanders exchanged uneasy glances before the AI specialist, a thin Drakal with glowing cybernetic implants, spoke. Their resistance patterns are inconsistent. They lack cohesion, yet they strike precisely where we are weakest. Kirath narrowed his eyes. That is contradiction. The specialist swallowed. Yes, Warlord, and yet it is truth. Voss leaned against the command table, watching the ghost war unfold. Hacked Drakal comms relayed conflicting battle reports. Entire human battalions that didn't exist were flanking enemy positions. Drakal warships moved to counter threats that weren't real, leaving actual weak points exposed. Make it worse, he muttered. His cyber warfare team nodded. The Drakal were creatures of logic, dependent on their flawless AI for battlefield superiority. But now, their AI was feeding on poisoned data. And then, the final strike. Voss's personal message beamed directly to Kirath's command ship. You're losing, you just don't know it yet. Desperation breeds innovation. The Drakal, realizing brute force alone wouldn't crush human morale, turned to bioweapons. Spore bombs detonated over major cities, releasing engineered pathogens designed to erode human biology at the cellular level. They expected panic. Collapse. Instead, human scientists cracked the pathogen's code in days. And then, humanity did something the Drakal never predicted. They modified it. What was meant to be a weapon against humanity became a virus that only targeted Drakal physiology. It spread through food supplies, atmosphere processes, even their own wounded. The first Drakal warriors stumbled in battle, gasping for breath. Then entire squads collapsed, convulsing, their immune systems failing. On the ground, humans saw their towering, unstoppable invaders clutching their throats, dying without a single shot fired. Panic erupted in Drakal command. The unstoppable war machine had just bled. Drakal warfare ran on algorithms, simulations that predicted outcomes with near-perfect accuracy. Until they met humanity, Earth's forces, pushed beyond the brink, stopped playing by any rulebook. One-man suicide runs took out entire supply convoys. Human snipers ignored high-value targets, instead focusing on disrupting supply chains. Drakal warships, designed for coordinated fleet battles, found themselves swarmed by lone scavenger ships packed with nuclear cores, detonating on impact. The AI simulations fractured. Their predictions were useless against pure, unfiltered human chaos. For the first time, the Drakal warlords could not see the future of the battle. And that terrified them. "They're getting desperate," Voss said, watching the enemy fleet's erratic movements. Good. The final trick, a surrender. Human distress signals echoed across all frequencies. A full-scale capitulation, begging for peace. The Drakal warlords, eager to erase their humiliation, fell for it. Their command ship moved forward, unshielded, to accept Earth's surrender. It was the last mistake they would ever make. The moment their flagship passed a certain point in orbit, Earth's last covert warfleet decloaked. Railguns roared, bombers struck. The Drakal command vessel broke apart, their leadership eviscerated in seconds. And with that, the entire invasion fell into chaos. Victory was a word Voss could barely bring himself to say. The Drakau were broken, their forces scattered, their warships retreating. And yet, as he stood on the ruined balcony of what had once been the Terran Defense Council, he saw nothing but devastation. Cities reduced to smoldering husks, entire continents uninhabitable. Humanity had won. But at what cost? The message arrived in silence. No fanfare, just a simple alert in his personal comms. His daughter's name. Deceased. Voss sat alone, staring at the message, reading it over and over again. The woman who had built Titan Station, the engineer who had given humanity its final weapon. Gone. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl through the ruined city. And for the first time since the war began, he let himself feel the weight of everything he had lost. The void trembled. From the depths of space, the Drakal Armada emerged, a force 3 times the size of their first invasion fleet. Monolithic warships, dark and jagged, stretched across the stars, their hulls bristling with weapons powerful enough to turn entire cities to ash. At their head, aboard the dreadnought Vaisharun, was Supreme Warlord Juxeroth, the architect of conquest. He had not come to battle, he had come to end the war. Humanity's defenses were in tatters. Scattered warships, gutted planetary defenses, soldiers who had fought for too long without rest. Every fleet admiral, every strategist who remained understood the truth. This was the final stand. There would be no retreat, no negotiations. Either humanity won here, or they were erased from history. Deep within Titan Station, buried under layers of abandoned infrastructure, lay a weapon of last resort, a relic of desperation built during the early years of the war. Project Darkstar, an EMP weapon of planetary scale. If detonated, it would fry every electronic system in its blast radius, human and Drakal alike. No shields could stop it. No countermeasures could soften the blow. The cost was unthinkable. Earth's defenses would be crippled. Communication satellites, orbital stations, even scavenged Drakal tech, gone in an instant. It would be a Pyrrhic victory, but victory nonetheless. Yet, in the shadows of bureaucracy, another plan had already been set in motion. The transmission was brief, a handshake agreement. In the cold halls of power, a faction within the Terran Defense Council had decided humanity's fate. The deal was simple: Titan Station and its weapon in exchange for survival. The Drakau were more than willing to accept. A race as stubborn as humanity had proven itself difficult to subdue, but even the most desperate fighters would break under a scalpel instead of a hammer. Elias Voss watched the security footage from his cell. His final disgrace. The very leaders he had fought to protect had signed away Earth's last hope. A silent fury burned through him. He had spent his life preparing for war, had torn himself apart to ensure humanity could stand against what lurked beyond the stars, and now, surrender. His captors came for him that night. His execution was set for dawn. They never made it that far. The door to his cell burst open, revealing Major Cole Vasquez and a squad of battle-worn loyalists. Their armor was scorched, their weapons half-charged. Desperation had become their currency. "Sir," Vasquez said, tossing Voss a sidearm, "we're not done yet." The escape was brutal. Security teams turned against each other, the station filled with alarms and emergency sirens as a civil war unfolded in microcosm. By the time Voss and his team reached the lower docks, the stolen gunship was already prepped for launch. "Where to, sir?" Vasquez asked as they strapped in. Voss holstered his weapon, eyes cold. Titan. It was time to finish this. The Drakal fleet moved with surgical precision, advancing on Titan Station with absolute certainty. They had taken the bait. Humanity's last bastion, the illusion of its final stronghold, laid out before them like an open wound. From deep space, human distress signals rang out. Fake cries for help, fake evacuations. The Drakal saw weakness. They did not see the trap. From the moment they entered Titan Station's range, human warships decloaked. Their numbers were pitiful compared to the Drakal armada, but they weren't here for a stand-up fight. They were here to drag the enemy into the kill zone. Drakal admirals barked orders, adjusting their formations. Too late. The bait had worked. The enemy flagship, the Vasharoon, was their true target, and Voss was already inside. The boarding action was a massacre. The Vasharoon's corridors ran red with Drakal blood as Voss's strike team pushed forward, carrying the EMP payload to its final destination, the heart of the enemy command deck. Drakal warriors towered over their human counterparts, their armor thick, their blades deadly, but they fought with discipline, with order. Humanity fought with desperation, with rage. "Voss, we're out of time!" Vasquez shouted, gunning down a charging alien. Voss staggered, blood seeping from a wound in his side. He ignored it. The detonator was in his hands. Duke Zerath stood before him, massive, armored, his eyes burning with fury. "You would destroy yourselves just to deny us victory," the warlord hissed. Voss exhaled sharply. "You still don't get it." His thumb pressed the trigger. The explosion wasn't fire, it was absence. A pulse that ripped through every electronic system, turning warships into floating corpses, AI-driven targeting into useless algorithms, soldiers into blind, deaf warriors. In the dark, Voss fell to his knees as the world faded to black. The silence was overwhelming. Across the battlefield, Drakal ships drifted lifelessly, their technology turned against them. Without their AI, without their war machines, they were powerless. For the first time in their empire's history, they ran. Back on Earth, humanity watched their invincible enemy retreat. The war was over. But the cost. Titan Station was gone, erased in the EMP's pulse. Voss was gone, lost in the detonation that had sealed humanity's fate. Earth was in ruins, its defenses crippled, its leadership shattered. Victory had come at the edge of oblivion. And yet, as humanity looked to the stars, there was one undeniable truth. The Drakal would never forget the day they had learned fear. The silence was absolute. In the cold void where once the Drakal fleet had loomed, there was now only debris. Hulking warships, their power cores fried, drifting aimlessly like metal corpses. The EMP strike had been precise, ruthless. Thousands of Drakal vessels, once the pinnacle of AI-driven warfare, were now little more than floating wreckage, their circuits dead, their engines cold. But humanity was stranded too. Earth satellites had gone dark. The orbital defense grid, what was left of it, was offline. Communication across the system had collapsed, leaving the survivors in chaotic isolation. For a moment there was nothing. No war cries, no victory cheers, just the slow realization that against all odds, against every expectation, humanity had survived. And then, through the static-ridden comms of a battered destroyer, a voice broke the silence. "They're crippled. We can finish this." The order was clear. The war wasn't over, not yet. Earth was a graveyard. The EMP had stolen the skies from both sides, grounding aircraft, silencing drones, and reducing the battlefield to the most primal form of combat. Humans versus Drakal, flesh versus scale. With their war machines dead, the Drakal found themselves trapped on the very world they sought to conquer. Stranded battalions, once unstoppable with AIS-assisted targeting and superior tech, were now hunted like prey. The humans adapted faster. Guerrilla fighters, scavenging what they could from ruined cities, crafted weapons out of wreckage and desperation. Snipers used manual scopes, lining up shots without AI assistance. Militia fighters wielded Molotovs and jury-rigged explosives, detonating entire Drakal squads in the ruins of their own war machines. The battles weren't swift, they weren't clean, they were brutal. And in the end, the Drakal warriors, so used to crushing resistance with sheer technological superiority, broke. They had come to claim a world. Instead, they left their dead behind. Duke Zerath stood on the shattered bridge of his ruined flagship, staring into the abyss. This was impossible. The Drakal did not lose wars. They had never lost a war. And yet, here they were, scattered, humiliated, bleeding. His remaining commanders hesitated. No one wanted to be the one to speak first. No one wanted to be the one to suggest what they all knew had to happen. Duke Zerath turned, his golden armor cracked and scorched, his once unbreakable confidence fractured. "This is not defeat," he said finally, voice cold. "This is a delay." There would be no surrender. That was beneath them. Instead, the Drakal fleet slowly disengaged, retreating into the void. They would never admit it. But the empire that had crushed thousands of species had just suffered its first true loss. The fires of war had faded, but Earth was unrecognizable. The once great cities were now burned husks, their silhouettes jagged against the endless smoke-choked sky. Entire regions were uninhabitable, radiation seeping into the ruins where Drakal bombardments had been the heaviest. The EMP had not just disabled the enemy, it had crippled Earth itself. Power grids were gone, supply lines had collapsed, there were no global governments left, only survivors. The war had not finished humanity, but it had left it hanging by a thread. In the wastelands, warlords and rogue factions rose. Starvation crept in, disease festered. Some whispered that humanity had saved itself, only to die a slower death. But no one dared say it aloud, because for all the ruin, for all the loss, they had won. And now it was time to rebuild. The chambers of the Terran Defense Council were quiet. Most of its members were dead. Some had perished in the bombardments. Others had been executed by their own people for what they had tried to do. The ones who remained were not leaders forged in politics, they were leaders forged in war. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of peace. Only one simple truth remained. The old ways had failed. The new world would be built in fire. In the shadows, those who had pushed for surrender, those who had conspired with the Drakal, were dragged from hiding. Justice, some called it. Vengeance, others whispered. But no one spoke out against it. Because weakness had nearly cost them everything, and weakness would never be allowed again. There was no body, no memorial. Titan Station was gone, consumed in the EMP blast that had saved humanity. But Elias Voss did not need a grave. His name was written in the stars. The man who had outwitted an empire, the man who had turned humanity's last hour into its first true victory. Some called him a hero, others a madman. History would debate his actions for generations. But as humanity rose from the ashes, reforging itself in the fires of survival, one truth remained. The war was over. But the fight to survive never ends. The stars had not changed. They still burned in the void, ancient and indifferent. But the beings that stared up at them from Earth's surface, from the scattered colonies beyond, were not the same. Humanity had reforged itself in fire. Decades had passed since the war. Cities that had once been smoldering ruins now stood tall, though their scars were not hidden. Beneath glass towers and humming power grids, memorials lined the streets, memories etched into steel, faces immortalized in stone. Technology had surged forward, fueled by the remnants of the Drakal war machine. Faster ships, more powerful weapons, AI defenses that would never again be caught off guard. And above it all, hanging in the black void where Titan Station once stood, was a single inscription carved into the hull of Earth's newest warship. We remember. They would never be caught unprepared again. The Drakal do not speak of Titan Station in the open. It is whispered in war councils. It is etched into their history like a wound that refuses to heal. The empire that had swallowed entire star systems now speaks of humanity with something dangerously close to fear. They call them the ghosts of Titan, a species that should have died in fire but instead emerged stronger, smarter, unpredictable. Their simulations cannot account for the madness of human war doctrine. Their strategists warn against testing them again. And yet, the younger warlords scoffed. They were an empire. What were humans really but a lucky accident? Vraktal had never been one for myths. She was a historian, a scholar, not a warrior. She had spent her life buried in archives, piecing together the real truth behind the Empire's many victories. But this, she ran her claws over the classified war reports, old battle logs that had been sealed away, records that painted a different picture than the one she had been taught. The Empire had always claimed that humanity had used dishonorable tactics, that the victory at Titan was a fluke, a coward's trick. But the reports told a different story. The Drakal hadn't lost because of treachery. They had lost because they had underestimated humanity at every step. And worse still, they had given them time to evolve. She leaned back in her seat, staring at the final transmission sent before the Empire had retreated. The last recorded words of Elias Voss. Her scales bristled. Humanity had returned to the stars. And this time, they were the ones preparing for war. The Drakal war machine was stirring again. New war fleets were being assembled, new battle plans drawn. They had learned from their mistakes, or so they believed. But intelligence reports carried a warning, one the younger warlords refused to hear. Humanity was not just rebuilding. They were arming. Their fleets had grown, their ships faster, their weapons more devastating than before. They were no longer the desperate, outgunned survivors of the last war. They were something else entirely. And when the time came, they would not be the ones on the defensive. The transmission was short. No encryption, no origin traceable. Just a simple message, drifting across Drakal channels like a ghost in the void. They thought us weak. They thought us broken. They will never make that mistake again. The warlords laughed. But deep down, something in them remembered. The next war would not be like the last.